In February 1942, a Boeing B-17E Flying Fortress, serial number 412471, belonging to the United States Army Air Forces, crash-landed on the island of Java. The crew had been attempting to escape advancing Japanese forces during the fall of the Dutch East Indies. When Japanese troops discovered the wreckage, they quickly realized the immense value of what they had captured. This was no ordinary aircraft. It was one of the most advanced four-engine bombers in the world at that time. Its loss was significant to the Americans, but its capture proved to be an unexpected gift to the Japanese, who had never before seen such a large and sophisticated aircraft up close. The B-17E represented the pinnacle of American air power in the early 1940s. It was rugged, heavily armed, and designed for high-altitude, long-range bombing missions. To the Japanese, who had built their air forces around lighter, more agile aircraft like the Mitsubishi A6M0 and the twin-engine Mitsubishi K21, the Flying Fortress was an entirely different breed of war machine. While the Zero embodied elegance, craftsmanship, and maneuverability, the B-17 embodied brute strength, mass production, and industrial precision. When the Japanese recovered several other damaged or crash-landed flying fortresses during the early months of the Pacific War, from Java, the Philippines, and even parts of China, they began an ambitious technical investigation program. The aircraft were carefully crated and shipped to Japan, where they were taken to the Giken, the Air Technical Research Institute at Tachikawa Airfield near Tokyo. There, under the supervision of Major Kazuyuki Saito, a team of the Imperial Japanese Army Air Force's best engineers began a systematic examination of the captured bombers. The project spanned from 1943 to 1945, and during that time they disassembled, documented, and analyzed nearly every component of the Flying Fortress. At first, the Japanese engineers were awestruck by the B-17's sheer scale. It was massive compared to anything in Japan's arsenal. Its wingspan stretched over 100 feet, and its four Wright 1820 Cyclone radial engines gave it power and endurance the Japanese found astonishing. But beyond size, it was the method of construction that stunned them. Japanese aircraft production before and during the war had been rooted in traditional craftsmanship. Skilled artisans, many trained in pre-war aircraft shops, built planes with careful precision, but often with unique hand-fitted components. Parts were adjusted individually to fit each airframe. There was little concept of perfect interchangeability. The process was slow, labor-intensive, and dependent on highly skilled workers. The B-17, however, was something else entirely. The engineers at Tachikawa found that every piece, from rivets to panels to control surfaces, was standardized. Components could be removed and replaced with identical parts from another aircraft without any need for adjustment. The Japanese were astounded. It was as if the bomber had been born from a giant machine, not a workshop of artisans. Major Saito's team carefully mapped out the rivet patterns, wiring systems, hydraulic lines, and the structure of the fuselage. They noticed the simplicity and consistency of the production techniques. Boeing's manufacturing design allowed the bomber to be built by semi-skilled laborers in assembly line conditions rather than master craftsmen. Where Japanese engineers used hand tools and measured by eye, Boeing used jigs, templates, and precision instruments that ensured every piece met exact standards. The reports from Tachikawa describe the Japanese engineers' mixture of admiration and dismay. They realized that while Japan's aircraft were beautiful and meticulously built, they could never be produced in the numbers needed to compete with American industry. The B-17 was not just a machine, it was the embodiment of an entire industrial philosophy.
Boeing's Plant 2 in Seattle, where most B-17s were produced, was a marvel of wartime efficiency. By 1944, it could turn out 16 completed bombers per day. Each aircraft contained more than 350,000 parts, yet every component fit perfectly, thanks to standardized production methods. The Japanese, struggling with material shortages and limited industrial capacity, could not imagine achieving such output. The Air Technical Research Institute's findings were kept secret, of course. Wartime censorship and Japan's increasingly dire situation meant few outside the engineering circles ever heard of the B-17 examinations. But within those circles, the lessons began to sink in. Engineers documented how the Americans used aluminum alloys, modular assembly, and rationalized production. They noticed how wiring and systems were laid out to allow for quick maintenance and easy replacement. The contrast to Japanese designs, which often required disassembly to reach certain components, was striking. By 1944, as Japan's industrial base was being systematically destroyed by Allied bombing, these engineers understood that they were witnessing a different kind of war, one fought not only in the skies, but in the factories. The United States had become what President Franklin D. Roosevelt called the arsenal of democracy. Its power lay not just in innovation, but in the ability to mass-produce reliable machines faster than the enemy could destroy them. The captured B-17s became a kind of mirror, showing Japan its own industrial limitations. The engineers at Tachikawa reportedly remarked that the Americans had industrialized skill itself. In other words, they had managed to transform craftsmanship into a repeatable, mechanized process. That realization was both humbling and inspiring. One of the most intriguing aspects of this story came at the very end of the war. American intelligence analysts, during reconnaissance flights over Japan in 1945, photographed what they believed to be a new Japanese heavy bomber prototype at Tachikawa. They dubbed it the Tachikawa 104. In reality, the aircraft they had spotted was likely one of the captured B-17s being examined by Japanese engineers. The misidentification fueled brief speculation that Japan had developed its own four-engine bomber, but post-war investigations clarified the truth. When the war finally ended in 1945, American occupation forces discovered detailed Japanese reports and photographs documenting the disassembly and analysis of the B-17s. These documents later contributed to the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, which sought to understand Japan's wartime industrial capabilities. American investigators found that the Japanese had learned a great deal from their study of American aircraft, but had lacked the resources to apply those lessons during the war itself. However, the influence of those lessons did not vanish with Japan's surrender. Many of the engineers who had studied the Flying Fortress went on to play key roles in Japan's post-war industrial and technological rebirth. During the 1950s and 1960s, as Japan rebuilt its industries, concepts like standardization, interchangeability, and mass production became central to its manufacturing philosophy. The very insights gleaned from examining the B-17 helped shape Japan's transformation from a wartime empire to a peacetime industrial powerhouse. Major Saito and his team had learned a hard truth, that modern warfare depended not just on bravery or skill, but on industrial systems capable of sustaining the fight. America's victory had been powered by its factories as much as by its armies. During the war, the U.S. produced over 12,700 B-17 Flying Fortresses, an unimaginable figure for a nation like Japan, which struggled to produce even a few hundred aircraft of equivalent complexity. Each B-17 represented not only American engineering, but also a collective industrial effort. Parts were built in multiple states, shipped by rail to final assembly plants, and fit together seamlessly. The aircraft was designed from the outset for scalability. It was, in essence, an industrial weapon.
The Japanese engineers' admiration was genuine. In some of their surviving notes, they described the B-17's construction as monumental and beyond current domestic capacity. They paid special attention to the quality of aluminum riveting, the precision of the electrical systems, and the durability of the landing gear, all areas where Japan's wartime production suffered due to shortages and inconsistent quality control. To the Japanese military command, the findings were both impressive and depressing. By 1943, Japan's war industry was already overextended. Even if they adopted some of the American techniques, the infrastructure simply wasn't there to implement them. Factories lacked automation, and supply chains were fragmented. Skilled labor was increasingly scarce as the war dragged on. But the intellectual seeds planted at Tachikawa would grow after the war. Engineers who had studied at the Giken later joined post-war companies like Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, Kawasaki, and Nakajima's successor firms. They carried with them the understanding that industrial efficiency and consistency were not enemies of craftsmanship. They were its evolution. When Japan began producing automobiles, electronics, and consumer goods in the 1950s and 1960s, it applied the very principles that the B-17 had demonstrated so clearly. Assembly line production, standardized components, and rigorous quality control became hallmarks of Japan's manufacturing identity. It was, in a way, the post-war echo of lessons learned from an enemy aircraft examined in wartime secrecy. The story of the captured B-17s is not widely known, but it remains one of the most fascinating examples of how technology can teach even its enemies. The aircraft that once symbolized American might in the skies became, for Japan, a classroom in modern industrial design. In the years after the war, as Japan's economy surged, many observers noted how quickly the nation adopted Western manufacturing methods and then refined them. The roots of that transformation reach back to places like Tachikawa, where engineers once stood around the massive frame of a flying fortress, measuring, sketching, and marveling at what industrial discipline could achieve. The B-17 taught them that precision need not come from the hands of artisans alone. It could come from the systems that empowered thousands of workers to build something identical, reliable, and powerful. That realization reshaped an entire nation's approach to making things. By the time Japan had emerged as a world leader in technology and manufacturing by the late 20th century, the irony was complete. The same philosophy that had given America its wartime advantage had become the foundation of Japan's post-war miracle. The captured B-17s at Tachikawa Airfield were eventually scrapped as the war ended. Their metal melted down or lost in the ruins of Japan's defeated empire. But their impact endured far longer. The lessons they offered about standardization, industrial organization, and the power of mass production continued to echo through Japan's factories, industries, and universities for decades to come. In the end, the Flying Fortress had fulfilled its purpose in a way no one could have predicted. Even in captivity, even as a silent, dismantled machine under the gaze of its enemies, it carried a message that transcended war. It showed that victory in the modern age belonged not merely to those who could build the finest machines,
but to those who could build many of them, each identical, efficient, and ready for battle. And in that revelation, the seeds of Japan's future greatness were quietly sown amid the wreckage of war.